Excellent. So, watering for a healthy landscape. Once again, thank you so much for coming and sharing the afternoon with me. A couple of goals. As an educator, we always have to have goals. We're going to talk about proper watering techniques. We're also going to talk about the needs of your various watering objects, whether it be plants or lawns or vegetables or what have you. And we're also going to talk about some improper watering techniques this afternoon. As you all know, and this is pretty obvious, watering is so important for all of your plants. Um, the plants actually are filters to reduce concentrations of pathogens, heavy metals, and other pollutants from storms or water runoffs. Plant roots significantly increase soil stability as well as decrease soil erosion caused by water runoff. Trees, I thought this is a very interesting statistic. Trees actually capture up to 50% of rainfall. So parking lots with trees can reduce again that water runoff by up to 17% relative to those that do not have trees. And this information comes from, and you have these resources at the end, the National Initiative for Consumer Horticulture. Watering depends upon the type of plant that you have. It also depends upon the soil texture, the humidity, the season, if it is an established plant versus a newly installed or plotted plant, and of course, weather conditions, right? Makes sense. A very simple and easy thing that everybody can do is test the soil with your finger. Poke down a few inches near the stem of whatever it is you're checking and feel that root zone. There are soil moisture meters that can be purchased. But even if the surface seems dry, there can still be moisture underneath. I just use the old fashioned finger technique. I'm not a real fan of buying a ton of things. And if you're finding when you put your finger down, and we're going to talk about this a few minutes later, when you put your finger down a few inches, if you're finding that it's dry, grab some water. In general, and again, this is like the perfect week. It's crazy hot here. Extended periods of drought, as you all know, can negatively affect most plants. Water trees, then shrubs, then herbaceous plants. And what I mean by herbaceous plants are plants with soft stems. Large mature trees and older, more established shrubs can often be left alone unless the drought is so severe that the trees are beginning to wilt and the root systems are becoming disturbed, as it were, without that lack of water. Newly installed plants need to be watered immediately. And then for the next 2 weeks, and we'll go into greater detail later. So, and don't worry about writing all this down. This is just a quick overview. So again, newly installed plants, you water immediately after planting, and subsequently for the next 2 weeks, check that moisture level daily and water as deeply as is needed. You're going to get tired of hearing me say this, but you want to directly water the roots and not the leaves or the stems of the plants. And we're going to show images of what happens when you do that. With regard to trees, newly planted trees, you continue to water until the roots are established, and that can take upwards of 2 years. Again, all dependent upon where you're planting, the type of soil, the humidity, as well as the type of plant or tree, I should say, that you're planting. During the hottest, driest parts of the summer, you would want to water new plants at least once a week or as needed, depending upon your specific plant. So how do you know, right? How do you know? Well, here's a series of questions that you can ask yourself, okay? When assessing the water needs of your space or your plants, you want to ask yourself these questions. The first being, do you water Do you have a variety of water needs? So there are drought tolerant plants. There are some lawns. There are perennial beds. There are edible gardens. All of these are going to have different watering needs, not only with regard to quantity, but with regard to frequency. Okay. So when planning your yard, when planning your garden areas, it's often wise to think ahead. You want to think about those individual plant needs and how you're going to manage that water. Um, you might want to plant items that require the same quantity of water in the same area, so that you're not, dragging your hose or your can or however you water all over the place. Um, it also helps to keep neighboring plants healthy by not overwatering dry, loving plants. Another reason why you need to think ahead to what you're planting and its needs. It's not enough to just go to get a perennial and say, oh, it says full sun, I'm going to put it here. If you have that full sun plant next to a plant that also requires full sun, but not as much water, you're kind of between a rock and a hard place, if you understand what I'm saying. Also, keep in mind that shallow roots of annuals will probably be requiring more frequent watering than a deep rooted perennial. So therein again, a difference between the needs of an annual or a perennial. When we look at the second bullet point here, which is what is your climate like, we're talking about things like heat, which is obvious, but also the wind, also cool and cloudy conditions. All of these are going to result in a different need for watering for your garden. Um, there's also going to be the need for different application methods as well. When it comes to climate, it's essentially making obvious and simple plant choices. What is the best thing for the climate in your area? And as Debbie spoke earlier, we are talking to you as master gardeners from Kent County. We're in zone 7, 7A, but I know there are some people that are attending here today that are not from this area. So get familiar with that USDA map with your zone and see what's appropriate for your area. With regard to rainfall, our third bullet point here, again, any watering adjustments are going to have to be made relative to the rainfall that's happening. You're looking at daily, weekly, monthly, or even seasonally, right? If you're lucky enough to live in an area where Mother Nature is going to take care of a lot of that watering for you, make sure your watering system lets you adjust accordingly. Okay, that gives you the option, as it were. Next, you're looking at the actual site. Is your site sloped or is it flat? Well, why does it matter, right? Application methods and the rate at which you water is going to be relative to if the surface is flat and that allows time for the water to be absorbed versus it running down a slope, right? It makes sense, but maybe you never thought of it that way. I know I didn't, quite honestly, until I got a little bit more involved with gardening. Um, you also want to make considerations for and compensation for gravity, the trajectory at which you're watering, as well as the pressure. And again, for those of you who are in other areas of the country, elevation changes is something to keep in mind as well. You'll be mindful of not just the slope and whether it's flat, but also the exposure. Is the area that you're looking at exposed to a lot of winds that might be blowing away some of that topsoil? Our next bullet point talks about, is there a lot of sun or are your plants in a shaded area? Again, this might seem obvious, but a nice reminder, evaporation from the bright sun can steal upwards of 50% of that water from the soil, which is mind boggling. Clearly, shaded areas are going to hang on to that moisture a little bit longer, but you want to be careful that those areas don't become waterlogged. Something to be mindful as well. So, again, look at your area, look at your zone, look at your entire yard, as well as your grassy areas, your trees, your shrubs. Check out all of them. See what's getting full sun, See what's not getting full sun. Areas that get full sun might do better with a drip or soaker type irrigation. That is often a better option in areas that experience a lot of evaporation and are prone to wind. If it's a shaded area, maybe not so much. So it's really relative. I'm thinking you're probably getting the point by now. It's really relative to where you are and what is planted there and the exposures. Similarly, our next bullet point speaks to soil composition. Again, we'll speak about this a little bit later. Is it sandy? Is it clay? Is it very rich loam? Is it rocky? All of that plays a part in how well that water is absorbed, as well as how well it is drained, right? Clay soil is often referred to as a heavy soil. Um, in Delaware, it's my understanding that we have across the state very different and unique soil types. So again, getting that awareness is going to behoove you in this process. With clay soils, water is absorbed slowly and spreads out, and that clay can hold a lot. So it's best to water clay soils slowly, let that water soak in. That being said, when it's hot and dry, that clay soil is prone to cracking and it will dry out, and the roots might have a hard time penetrating it. So, again, looking at both sides of the equation. The best amendments for clay soil in the hopes of retaining water, we would recommend organic matter or compost. Helps improve that drainage. With sandy soil allows water to soak straight down without holding much of it. The plants will need to be watered more often and in a wider arc, believe it or not, to get the roots to spread out. And this will make sense as we go through some of these images. These plants are going to need to be watered much more often. The best amendments, again, for a sandy soil are organic matter or compost. If you're lucky enough to have a loam soil in combination with either a sand or a clay, you're lucky. This is really a great soil. It's rich in nutrients and distributes that water very evenly and has great drainage. Most gardeners are going to have a combination of answers to these questions, okay? You may have some areas with sun, you might have some with shade, you might have a mixture of level surfaces, you might have some areas that slope, but a good understanding of these factors is really going to help you make the best choice and match the right watering system or combinations of systems to the needs and the areas where you want your growth to occur. This is a lovely graphic that I found from the Virginia Cooperative Extension. And the reason why I loved it is because, as you see here, there are correct and incorrect ways to water. And it shows you very clearly here. Frequent light watering, such as emptying a small cup of water into a plant every day, that's going to encourage the roots to grow near the top of the pot in the soil. And you can bring this concept to, similarly occurring trees, shrubs, what have you. That's going to easily dry out. You can appreciate that with the shallow roots, right? Infrequent heavy watering encourages the roots to grow down towards the bottom of the pot, and it is less likely for those plants to dry out. So we want to water at the base of the plant, okay? And again, you'll see some graphics as we go through here. So plants, we're going to start with plants. The question here that I have for you all is, do you see something wrong with this picture? There is something wrong with this picture. Watering seems straightforward enough. Watering seems simple enough, but it can have a big impact on the way your plant grows. Sprinkler irrigation systems or overhead sprinkling is very popular and very common. However, As with the watering can here, this is sprinkling from above, giving that water from above. And you see it's hitting not only the flowering parts, but the leaves of the plant, the stems of the plant. That's wrong. We need to water at the base of the plant because we want to avoid getting the leaves wet. This is going to reduce a lot of follicular diseases, whether it be fungus or what have you. Um, and this is why soaker hoses are a nice option. Drip irrigation systems are a nice option to put those in before the plants emerge. You want to water deeply and less often to promote deeper, healthier root growth. Watering in the morning is the best. This is going to allow that water to soak in, and because of that, there will be less evaporation from either the heat or the winds or what have you. It's also going to allow time for any leaves that potentially had gotten splashed to dry before that heat of the day comes out. If you can't water in the morning, late afternoon is your second best choice. Just be sure that there's enough time for that foliage to dry before nighttime cooler temperatures come. Avoid watering in the heat of the day because number one, that water is going to evaporate much faster, and any overspray onto foliage or leaves could potentially cause those areas to actually burn in that heat. So let's talk about vegetables first and foremost. Remove as much mulch from the soil surface by using a spade or a trowel to dig into the soil. The top 1 inch of the soil may be dry, but again, as I had said earlier, do the finger test, stick it down about as far as you can. It could be moist underneath that top surface. If the soil is dry, 2 inches below the surface, it is time to water. And again, they make gizmos and gadgets. I don't recommend any in particular. I just use my finger or even a popsicle stick, tongue depressor, those kinds of things. Do not wait for rain to water your garden. If your plants and vegetables need water today and they're forecasting a rain shower tomorrow, water it today. Okay. If the plants are wilting or showing other signs of heat stress, water as soon as possible. This might be in the afternoon, it might be in the evening, but your plants are communicating to you. You just have to be mindful enough to pick up those messages. Fruits and vegetables need consistent water to produce fruit. Don't let them go completely dry in between waterings. This is going to cause problems. In things like tomatoes, you can get cracked tomatoes if you have uneven watering. You can get blossom end rot if you do not have proper watering. Keep in mind that winds dry out plants very quickly. The larger the leaves, things like squash, cucumbers, coral bells, the more moisture is going to be lost because they have a greater surface area to lose that moisture through evaporation. So if you're in an area where you're experiencing extremes in heat, it is not unreasonable to think of protecting the plants with barriers such as a shade cloth. This is going to be helpful with some windy areas or areas that have extremes in heat. They're still going to get their sun, but it's going to be a little bit more controlled, for lack of a better term. Here you see 2 pictures of people watering correctly. You see that they are watering directly into the dirt, directly into those roots, right? Not on top of the plants. You do not see these leaves getting wet here. You can use a rain gauge. You see here above, I have written vegetable gardens need approximately 1 inch of rain per week. And again, they sell all kinds of gizmos and gadgets. I'm a big fan of the tuna can method. Yet again, if it's free, I love it. And one other master gardener had turned me on to this method. He just takes an old tuna can, after he washes it out and places it in an area that would be appropriate. And that will measure, people will say, well, how do I know it's an inch? If your tuna can's full, then that's your inch. Um, it's simple, it's easy, and it works. Believe it or not, 1 inch of rain, 1 inch of water is a lot of water. Um, I found some statistics that for 100 square foot area, 1 inch of rain is actually the equivalent of 62 gallons. And I share that with you because that was amazing to me. 1 inch doesn't sound like a lot to me, but in fact, it actually is. Um, if you're looking to figure out how much water you are going to need for your space, you can actually do it by measuring the length and the width of your garden. We're talking about vegetables here. Multiply those numbers to get your total square footage. Good old fashioned math, right? If you have a garden, say that's 20 by 30, and you multiply those two, that's going to give us a 600 square foot garden. After a week without rain, that garden's going to need 372 gallons of water. So again, if you receive rain, but it's not a full inch over the course of a week, go water. And again, in sandy soils, you might need to water more frequently. So just keep in mind and really, no pun intended, stay on top of your garden and its needs. That being said, this is what I had spoken to earlier relative to specific types of soil. Keep in mind that plant nutrients come through their root, and those nutrients need water to get absorbed. It doesn't do your gardens any good if you're putting whatever in them, whatever compost, whatever over the counter, that you're being sold. If it sits in the dirt, it doesn't do your plants any good. Your plants need that water to absorb those nutrients. So a lack of water is equal to a lack of nutrients, right? Under drought stress, garden plants can produce smaller fruit. You'll find undersized tomatoes and melons, or they might not produce fruit at all. So if you're finding this, that might be part of the issue. They may become tough, fibrous, or bitter. We find that with underwater things like cabbage or turnips. They can bolt, which is sending up a flower stalk. This is going to stop the growth. You might find this in underwater lettuce or spinach, or they may wilt and die, which is the obvious, and I found that out the hard way. Let's move on to container gardening. Containers dry out much faster than plants that are in the ground. So they are going to need more frequent watering, especially if they are exposed to wind or placed where there was a lot of sun. You can apply 2 to 3 inches of organic mulch, such as bark or pine needles or even shredded leaves on the top of the soil in a container to help retain some of that moisture. Again, that's all relative to what you're growing there. The perfect example being pine needles. Pine needles are great. They're inexpensive, they're easy to work with, they're light, however, they're acidic. So this would be something you'd want to do with a blueberry plant, but maybe not with your geranium. So being mindful of what is in that container. Another thing to keep in mind with regard to containers, unglazed clay pots are more porous than a glazed or a plastic pot. So therein again, they're going to allow for more evaporation. So they're good. I mean, I have a lot of terracotta pots and I love them for a lot of different reasons, but I have to be mindful of the evaporation that's going on. But they're great. When we got the heavy rain the other day, they were great, so like everything, there's good and bad. So just be mindful again where things are and the exposures that they have. So here are some images of plants that are overwatered and underwatered. As with anything, too much of a good thing, too little of a good thing isn't good. The one on the top left you see is just a diagram, and we have a real plant on the bottom right, and you see what underwatered and overwatered looks like. Too much water is not a good thing. Plants can decline and die if their roots are too wet. Again, not only are the roots taking up nutrients, but they're also taking up oxygen for the soil, from the soil. If the water saturates the ground, there's going to be little or no oxygen available. Some plants can collapse and die in a few days if flooded. Other plants can survive a little bit longer with too much watering, but their fruit is going to be affected. Crops raised for storage, things like winter squash, rutabagas, potatoes, onions, they do not keep well if they are in an overly grown in an overly wet season. Also, a lot of leaf diseases can come into play if a plant is overwatered or the water is coming from overhead and touching those leaves and that stem. You'll see brown leaf edges you see on these graphics here. You can also see yellow leaves. This can signal an overwatering situation. So again, make sure you check your soil before you're watering. Um, if there's a big rain, as we had in our area just this past week, there's really not a whole heck of a lot you can do. But again, um, there are certain things like porous pots. Make sure your containers have holes in them to drain. And even if your container has a hole or holes in it to drain, I made this mistake too. I had it on the concrete and it essentially sealed off. So even though there was a hole there, it wasn't working effectively. So you might want to elevate your plants a little, on bricks or stones or what have you. That being said, a raised bed garden for vegetables is known to have better drainage than a bed in the ground. So again, there's lots of variables that come into play. Moving on to shrubs, and you see some tips here with bullet points. You need to find out if it is a new or established shrub because that affects what's going on greatly. This photo is from the University of Illinois Cooperative Extension, and it is a photo of a native bottle brush buckeye bush. You want to be mindful of choosing drought resistant native plants to your area. And again, understanding your USDA zone and understanding what is native to your area. And there are some resources not only on our website, on our Facebook page, but also in the references section if you're unfamiliar with what is native to our area here in Kent, Delaware. Newly planted trees and shrubs are going to require, as I had said earlier, more frequent watering than an established tree or shrub. They should be watered at planting time and then at specific intervals. For the first 1 to 2 weeks, water daily. Weeks 3 to 12, after you have planted, water every 2 to 3 days. And then after 12 weeks, water weekly until the roots are established. And again, keep in mind, this is relative to what you're experiencing in your area. Obviously, if there's rain, that's a whole other situation. When we look at trees, well, as you all know, watering helps young trees establish a healthy root system and start growing. Watering a newly planted tree is incredibly important. Oftentimes people will say, oh, I just went and I bought this beautiful tree and then I brought it home, I put it in and it died. A lot of times in my experience, people will put a tree in and say, and kind of forget it. It's a tree. They just grow on their own. Well, yes, but the watering is so exceptionally important. You want to apply water directly to the root ball. Okay. And you don't see a root ball on this picture, but the root ball is essentially what is underneath where those roots are. For some nurseries, they have them in pots. Other times you'll see a root ball in burlap. Be sure to keep the back-filled soil in the planting hole moist as well. This encourages the root to the roots to expand beyond that root ball. And that's what you want. You want them to extend. Um, Tree roots grow approximately 18 inches per year, which is mind blowing to me as well. And we want to encourage that. And you do that by watering correctly. This is an example of a watering schedule. And you all have this in the notes that were sent out to you. A watering schedule during the first 6 weeks of planting is a great idea. If it rains enough to soak the ground, obviously you can adapt and skip as needed. Um, these recommendations were taken from, again, one of the resources you have at the end of the PowerPoints from Tree Montgomery. And this is what they recommend. If it rains, but it's not enough to soak the ground and soak that root ball, you may need to augment. Or vice versa. If the rain is so much that it is soaking the ground, then you move on and you skip that watering and just adjust accordingly. Moving on to lawns. If you're establishing a new lawn or renovating an existing lawn, once again, it is critical to water your new seed and sod properly. Supplying enough water at a slow rate to soak at least 1 inch of soil 3 to 4 times a week. With new sod, you need to water daily for the first week, and then as the sod begins to take root, slow the watering to weekly. And I know this is a struggle, and I'm right there with you. I really struggle with this and lawns. And I fight with our landscaper pretty much all the time. I'm surprised he comes back every year, quite honestly. He's like, this lady. When we talk about lawn seed, for newly planted seed, again, you need to keep the soil moist. Since the soil is exposed, you might want to cover it with a straw mulch to help prevent some of that evaporation. Also prevent the animals from coming to eat your seed, hopefully. Again, monitor your soil moisture. Your finger works just fine. If it is windy, if it is sunny, if it is an open area of your lawn, you might need to bump it up and water daily. Again, it's all relative. These are just broad guidelines. When applying the water to newly seeded or sodded lawns, soaker hose is great. A sprinkler is great. Again, as I had said earlier, you would want to do so in the morning because that's when you're going to have the least amount of evaporation. Okay. It is recommended that you avoid evening watering if at all possible, because if the grass stays moist overnight, it's very easy to get a fungal disease. So, Delaware livable lawns. I don't know why the Delaware came off of this. Maybe it was, oh, you can kind of sort of see it faintly. It must be blue. Most lawns in Delaware go dormant during the summer in response to drought stress. These lawns are not dead. They will green up and continue to grow vigorously when the fall arrives. The most common grass that I know of in Delaware is tall fescue. And in a few cases, the turf could die from this stress. But that gives you the opportunity to correct the problem by either reseeding these areas in the fall or resodding. And again, Delaware Livable Lawns is in your resources. It's a great site to explore a lot of information about having viable lawns. And this is an image of a lawn that is experiencing some stress. Irrigation for lawns comes to deciding when and how much to apply. Applying too little can cause that area to not grow as well. Obviously, applying too much can not only wash away your fertilizer, but it can also waste money because that water is just going to run off potentially. Um, and it might actually cause it to be so wet that it's going to impede growth because, again, those roots are going to be so saturated they cannot absorb the nutrients that they need. Um, there are software and apps that can be used to determine calculations for square footage of lawns. I don't have one particular recommendation. Um, quite honestly, I haven't used any of them. But if you're interested and if technology is your thing, that might be something you want to explore. Um, when we speak to ways to irrigate all these different areas, I just wanted to give a quick little review about the different methodologies that we have. The first being you see here on the left, pop-up sprinklers. Many of you might be familiar with those. They pop up from underground systems that spray water, usually used for lawn irrigation. They really broadcast water on a very broad area, but they can be very wasteful. They use a large amount of water. If it's a really hot, windy day, some estimates say that 50% of that water could be evaporated. Another disadvantage is that the amount of water that's used could be run off. So it's important to really try and adjust and tailor to the area that needs it. Um, with regard to expense, that's all relative. Um, and listen, I've got it. I've got it. But you do have to be very mindful with this overhead watering system, that because of it, fungal diseases will thrive on any wet foliage. So you want to be careful. Some of my pop-up sprinklers hit my perennials, and inevitably, no matter what I do, it's tough to contain unless I put some kind of a shield, and that's what happens every year to certain areas. Um, so it's challenging. It's challenging. To the right, you see, literally and figuratively, a drip irrigation system. For those of you who are not familiar with this, this is a series of tubing and nozzles that we would call emitters that allow more pinpoint and exact watering. Drip irrigation systems take some planning to install, but they do conserve water by putting it only where it's needed. It can be applied in a very slow rate, so that the concern about runoff and evaporation isn't so much of a concern here. Um, in areas where water is scarce or use is restricted, these drip systems can be one of your best options. And a great advantage is that the foliage stays dry, so fungal conditions might not be as much of a concern. Um, so we also have soaker hoses. This is different than a drip irrigation system. Soaker hoses have far more, they're similar to the drip system. Sometimes they can be less expensive. Soaker hoses also release the water directly into the soil, so water conservation is a great benefit to these. Um, there are various types of soaker hoses. They can be plastic, they can be rubber, they can even be canvas. Some designs permeate the water through the entire surface, and they have much more, many more little holes in their hoses. Um, they can be moved throughout the garden. They can be turned on and off manually. You can put most of these systems on a timer as well. They can be left in place as well. Good old-fashioned portable sprinklers here on the right, probably one of the least expensive options. However, they can be incredibly inefficient. Most spray water into the air. Again, we're looking at evaporation. It can be blown away with the wind. Again, it might not be hitting an area I mean, here it looks like it's hitting some plants. Again, you might be concerned about fungal diseases with that as well. Oftentimes, these sprinklers will put out water faster than the soil can absorb. So it's not getting you anywhere. Slow and steady is the way we want to water. There's also self-watering containers. I have seen those far more frequently in the last couple of years. Maybe it's just my awareness. I don't know if they're being marketed more. Um, Self-watering containers are specialized containers. I think I have a picture of them. Oh yeah, yeah, we talk about them in a minute. Um, so here's your good old-fashioned hose. Who doesn't love a good hose? Garden hose is nice for a hands-on approach. You don't have to spray an incredibly large area. You can just spot water, as it were, for lack of a better term. One of the benefits is that it gets you out there, it gets you looking at your garden, seeing what's going on. However, again, you want your rate to be slow so that you don't have that runoff and you do have time for the plants or what have you to absorb in the soil. You also want to be mindful of not spraying all over the place. I have a daughter who is the queen of this. She's just thinks she's having a, you'd think she was like 2 years old. She's spraying the water all over the place. No matter how many times I explain it to her, again, you want to be concerned. You want to water the soil, not the leaves, not the stems of anything. Water the soil. We're watering the roots. That's how the water gets into the plants. It's a relatively simple concept. Good old fashioned watering can you have here to the right. Um, Kind of nice if you have a small garden. It's relatively inexpensive, although I've seen some that were crazy expensive, and I don't really know why. Again, watering cans are a nice option in that they allow you to water directly into that dirt, right, at the base of the plant. So you can keep the foliage dry if you aim it correctly. Um, they can be handy for watering indoor plants. My concern about watering cans are that they're crazy, crazy heavy when they're filled with water. Water is heavy. Um, so if you have any kind of a physical limitation or are not able, I took my watering can once and filled it with water, and I think it was about 20 to 25 pounds. It's heavy. So be mindful of other options. You might want to use a smaller container. Sometimes I'll just take a measuring cup to water my indoor plants. And maybe I have to make more trips back and forth, but it's lighter and easier for little old me with my olive oil arms. Um, this is what I was referring to earlier, these self-watering containers. Um, you see here, I like this graphic on the left. It kind of explains it as I'm speaking of it a little bit better. These are really specialized containers that have an upper pot, and you see those as being green here, that holds the plant and the soil. And you can find these for house plants. I've seen them for like larger outdoor plantings, as it were. The lower reservoir will hold water and it's actually wicked up to the soil. Um, it's my understanding that usually these plants will hold a couple of days worth of water. Again, it's all relative to how large that reservoir is. Um, it all also depends upon the weather that you're experiencing. If it's extremely hot, that might be an issue. Although they are called self-watering, you still need to put the water in there so it can wick up. So you're still going to have to go and be mindful of what's going on there. This picture on the bottom right speaks to tree and shrub bags. Um, these help new trees and shrubs get established. They're a slow, deep watering system. The tree bags actually get filled with water, and that's what this gentleman in this image is doing. And it is released slowly into the ground, allowing for a full saturation of that area and the root ball. The bags are relatively inexpensive. I have not personally used this method, but it's nice because it eliminates that concern surrounding runoff. Um, and for municipalities, I know they find them much easier to deal with. There is also another option where you have systems that will collect rainwater. And this is a really broad category. There are rain barrels, rain traps, cisterns, and overflow kits, all of which can be used to collect rainwater. So, rainwater has some benefits. In addition to conserving a precious resource, it's free, which is a win. Um, it can be better for your plants because it will not contain chemicals that you might find, such as chlorine or fluoride, in some municipalities' tap water. Um, if sodium is added to tap water as well in your municipality, um, sodium is a softener, and it can actually be damaging to the soil of the plants. Um, as well, there's some municipalities where you're going to see other substances added. So you might want to do a little research and see what is added and how that might affect what you're growing in your area. Rainwater is also pretty neat because it contains nitrogen. Nitrogen makes plants green, and it is absorbed pretty readily from the roots um, into the leaves of the plant. So, so that's a benefit with regard to rainwater to be mindful of. If you are interested in installing a rainwater collection system, you also want to be sure to check your local regulations and laws. Um, and it again varies by town, municipalities, states, what have you. Um, so check that out before you're interested in doing something like that. Keep in mind as well that water from rain barrels is not drinkable. Okay. Um, it generally um, should not be used to water or irrigate edible plants. So this might not be something you want to do for your vegetables, fruits, edible flowers, greens that you might be growing. Um, and again, rainwater barrels need to be cleaned and maintained because of the conditions. Um, they can grow algae. And ultimately, if it gets that bad, it can actually clog the system. So here's some tips about rain barrels and those types of water collection systems. And again, you have these in your PowerPoints. Um, there's lots of different materials, there's lots of different shapes, different designs, different colors. If you search rain barrels online, you're going to come out with so many things. It's just mind blowing. Um, they can be a strong accent or a focal point to your garden. So if you're interested in that, something to keep in mind. Um, most rain barrels, in my experience, hold anywhere from 50 to 55 gallons of water. So once it's there and it's full, it's staying there. Rain barrels normally come with a water outlet and a hose. The outlet for overflow and even a screen to prevent debris or small animals from falling into the barrel. Some things to be mindful of. You would want to position your barrel under a spout so that runoff from your roof or what have you can go directly into the rain barrel. You'll probably want to raise your rain barrel onto blocks or wood or cinder blocks, what have you, so it can drain as much water as possible from a spigot. If you're putting it directly against the ground, you're not going to have any angle to hook up to that spigot. Just practical points. Um, Install, if it doesn't have it, a screen to collect leaves, sticks, debris that might try to fall in. Also prevents small animals. Um, Also, if it does not have one, install an overflow to prevent your barrel from overflowing, literally. And that overflow can be directed to the base of a tree, or you can, direct it wherever you want. It has to be cleaned, as I said, because of algae. Fall is often a good time to do this. Um, what else? And here are some other photos of different setups that I had found online to share with you. Um, when you're cleaning your rain barrel, you're going to be using a long handled brush to clean the inside with water and a detergent. probably an algicide containing detergent, and you're going to want to rinse it extensively. If you are in an area where freezing is a concern and you're going to be storing your barrel over winter, you would want to store it upside down, believe it or not, um, to get that any moisture that remains out. And obviously remove the hose, remove the overflow, remove the screen, and store all of those in an area such as a garage or a shed and such. Um, because obviously, as you all know, water expands. So if you're storing it in an area where it's going to be frozen, you might just crack it. So these are my takeaways. Here's my 8 golden rules for watering. Keep your soil evenly moist. Most plants depend on an even moisture. Slightly drying out between watering um, is okay. For some plants, it might promote some root growth, but you want to be mindful to water less often and more thoroughly. Better to water more seldom, but with plenty of water, rather than a little more often. Water late in the evening or early in the morning. When you water, um, the cooled soil in the evening or at night, um, there's going to be less evaporation. Similarly, within the morning, um, keep the leaves dry to avoid diseases. Wet leaves are diseased leaves. And if they're kept wet overnight, again, it could be a major issue. As such, also watering in the heat of the day, if those leaves are wet, it could actually cause scalding or burning of those water droplets in those leaves. You want to ensure that the water reaches the roots, so water sufficiently to reach the roots. Too low, the water quantities are only going to be in the superficial few centimeters. It's not going to reach that root ball. It's not going to help. Think about covering your specific area with some kind of mulch to maintain retention of that moisture. Give larger quantities of water in parts. Give the soil some time to soak it in. You know, it's not enough to put it there. The soil needs to soak it in. And if it's too much too fast, and you all have seen this, I'm sure, with storms in your area, it's just going to run off. That doesn't do anybody any good. Water is a precious commodity, and we need to be mindful of that. Water with a target, but distribute. Always watering at only one root point leads to lopsided root growth. So we're watering the root ball in a circle, not at one spot. Okay. Um, always water around the plant and distribute that irrigation throughout. Irrigation is a way to save water. Again, water is a precious commodity. You can simplify, and again, it's all relative to your area. Many of these concepts don't just apply to if you have a huge lawn. Many of these concepts can be applied to those who live um, in an area where you're just having plants on your balcony, or you just have a small bed, or just containers. That's fine. But most importantly, please, please, please do not waterlog your plants. Waterlogging suppresses breathing of the air through the roots. The root cells will drown, literally drown, which is not good. Here's some information for those of you in Delaware, both the Delaware Water Watch, which will tell you about water contents in your area, as well as well water testing that is done through the Department of Public Health. And here are the references that I referred to earlier, including Tree Montgomery, and a wonderful article by our own Sue Barton at University of Delaware about watering in your lawns. The link for Delaware Livable Lawns as well. Last but not least, some items of business in that we do not discriminate on the grounds of race, creed, color, sex, age, gender, national origin, sexual orientation, veteran, or handicap status, and we do not recommend any brand name materials. And last but not least is any questions, please? Let's see here.
Sure thing. There were a couple questions that came. Sorry, there were a couple questions that came in the chat box while you were talking, and I just noticed that Debbie put the evaluation in the chat box. So if you could click on that, when we're done here, that would be super, super helpful. Just how we could do things better next time, and what worked well this time. So the first question is, does the 2-inch rule also apply to plants?
It depends on the type of plant that you have. So again, doing some investigation and seeing the requirements of your plants. There are some plants that require far more water than others. For example, there are some native plants, there are some native milkweeds. There's a perfect example. All the milkweeds, for the most part, require full sun, but some of them do much better in a wet, boggy area than others. So you really have to investigate the needs of your specific plant. And the cooperative extension is a wonderful way to do that with reputable material, because there's a lot of crazy stuff out on the internet. But look to us.
The second question is from Sherry. She says it's a dumb question, but there's no such thing as dumb questions.
No, there's not.
She said, when I stick my finger in the ground, what should I see if plants need watering, or doesn't it?
That's actually an excellent question. So if you stick your finger in soil and the soil is dry, your finger will come back without any soil attached to it. I mean, it's going to be dirty, but it's not going to have any moist soil sticking to your finger. If you stick your finger in soil that is moist, you will come out with a lot of dirt on your finger. And people will say to me, well, how do I know? The more you do it, the more you get familiar with what to expect. It just kind of takes practice like anything else. But that's an excellent question. And I should have said that earlier. So thank you.
The next question is, how much water in inches per 7 to 10 day interval?
Depends on what you're talking about. It depends on what you're talking about. As I said, with lawns, they require about an inch a week. With vegetables, again, vegetables require consistent, even watering. If you do not water consistently and evenly, you're going to get, tomatoes that crack. And that's one indication that you're watering unevenly. So it depends on what you're growing, where it's growing. For example, when I had my vegetables planted in a traditional ground bed, they needed far less watering than what I have now in a raised bed, because the evaporation in the raised bed is far more significant. So again, it's taking the information that we spoke about today and the examples we talked about today and applying them relative to your zone, your conditions, what it is that's planted there. So there's not an exact answer. I wish I could give you one. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think it makes sense. If there are any other questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. We have one more question that came through. It said, I water each day, once in the morning and once in the evening, for my beans and cucumber plants. Do I have to use a large amount of water each time?
I do not think you need to lose a lot of water each time. But that being said, I don't think you have to do both. I think if you do either the morning, which is the preferable time, or the evening, and do it slowly. If you're watering by hose, you can get an attachment. I had meant to bring that with me, but there's every gadget I have seen to attach at the end of a hose has the availability to adjust the speed by which you're watering. Everyone has a different name,
Right. So my thing is, you're almost better off to water not as frequent, but when you do water, to water fully and deeply rather than to water, very frequently, especially with beans. Beans can be a little bit And cucumbers is the same. You want to be careful not to overwater them for sure.
Thank you for coming, and Debbie, Linda, and Anita, thank you all for your help as well. I greatly appreciate it.